If a nuclear weapon detonates in the vacuum of deep space, it doesn't leave a crater. It just expands outward, in a brief, chaotic flash of plasma and radiation, leaving behind millions of pieces of twisted, radioactive shrapnel. But if you were looking at the exact aftermath of an antimatter torpedo, you wouldn't see shrapnel. You wouldn't see a drifting debris field. You would just see a mathematically flawless 100-kilometer-wide sphere of absolute, terrifying nothingness. A perfectly carved-out bubble in the fabric of reality where an entire fleet of heavily armored warships used to be. It doesn't break enemy ships into pieces. It simply deletes them from the physical universe. For over a century, the absolute peak of human destruction has been the thermonuclear warhead. But here is a little-known, highly unsettling fact about nuclear weapons. Mathematically speaking, they are incredibly pathetic. When a massive hydrogen bomb detonates, it only actually converts about 1% of its radioactive material into explosive energy. The other 99% is essentially wasted mass. But antimatter doesn't play by those crude, primitive rules. Antimatter is the only substance in the known universe that operates on a 100% mass-to-energy conversion rate. When a particle of antimatter touches a particle of normal matter, they don't just break apart or shatter. They mutually annihilate. They erase each other from existence entirely, instantly releasing every single joule of potential energy trapped inside their mass in a blinding, apocalyptic flash of pure gamma radiation. To put that terrifying math into perspective, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by humanity was the Tsar Bomba. It yielded 50 megatons of explosive force, but the bomb itself weighed 27,000 kilograms and was the size of a school bus. To generate that exact same apocalyptic yield using antimatter, you don't need a school bus. You only need about 1 single kilogram of antiprotons, a payload roughly the size of a grapefruit. But that tiny glowing grapefruit presents military engineers with the single most terrifying paradox in the entire history of weaponized physics. How exactly do you build a bomb casing for a substance that violently, instantly explodes the exact microsecond it touches literally anything? You can't put it in a metal box, you can't surround it with glass or plastic or even atmospheric air. The exact moment a single, stray atom of the bomb casing touches the antimatter payload, the weapon detonates inside your own armory. So you don't use physical material at all. You build a magnetic bottle. Deep inside the sleek, pitch-black titanium hull of the torpedo is a highly advanced array of supercooled, superconducting electromagnets. They generate a hyperdense, constantly fluctuating magnetic field known as a penning trap, which suspends that single kilogram of antimatter perfectly in the dead center of an absolute vacuum chamber. It is floating in the dark, entirely untouched by the physical world. But really stop and think about the sheer psychological terror of carrying this weapon on a combat vessel. A nuclear warhead is inert until you actively trigger the firing sequence. You can drop it, hit it with a heavy wrench, or crash the ship, and the nuclear core will not detonate. An antimatter torpedo is entirely different. It is essentially a live, activated grenade where the pin is being held in place by a fragile battery. If your ship's power grid fluctuates for even 1,000th of a single second, if the magnetic field drops by a fraction of a millimeter, and that grapefruit-sized cloud of antimatter casually brushes against the interior titanium wall of the vacuum chamber, your entire ship, your entire crew, and thousands of cubic miles of the space around you are instantly and permanently evaporated. You are constantly carrying your own apocalyptic death sentence, praying the magnets don't fail. So what actually happens when the captain finally decides to pull the trigger? When the torpedo is launched from the tube, it doesn't streak toward the enemy fleet with a massive, fiery exhaust trail. It moves in absolute silence, propelled by dark gravity drives, painting a target that has absolutely no idea what kind of physics-breaking nightmare is rushing toward them. If the enemy sensors manage to detect the incoming torpedo, they are faced with a brutally fatal dilemma. Standard military doctrine dictates you use point defense lasers to shoot down incoming missiles. But if a high-energy laser melts the casing of an antimatter torpedo, the magnetic trap instantly fails. The antimatter drops, touches the molten slag of the hull, and the torpedo detonates exactly where it is. You cannot disarm it. You cannot deflect it. Destroying the weapon is the exact same thing as pulling the trigger. When the torpedo reaches the dead center of the enemy formation, the onboard targeting computer doesn't ignite a spark. it simply does the exact opposite. It turns the magnetic bottle off. For a fraction of a millisecond, the antimatter drops. It makes physical contact with the inner wall of the casing. And then, the fundamental laws of physics are violently rewritten. There is no fire, because fire requires oxygen. There is no kinetic shock wave, because in the vacuum of space, there is no air to push. There is only a sudden, silent eruption of pure, blinding gamma radiation moving outward at exactly the speed of light. As this invisible sphere of divine energy expands, it doesn't just tear metal apart, it unzips it at the subatomic level. The heavy, depleted uranium armor plating of the enemy cruisers, the crew running through the corridors, the highly explosive munitions in their magazines, the stray dust particles floating in the void, all of it is instantly converted into raw, chaotic photons. The temperature inside the blast radius spikes to trillions of degrees, making the absolute core of our sun look like a freezing winter morning. And then, just a few seconds later, it is completely over. The blinding light dissipates into the endless, freezing dark. But what is left behind is deeply, psychologically unsettling. Normally, after a massive naval engagement, the orbital space is littered with the tragic, visual graves of the fallen. Burning hulls, leaking oxygen lines, shattered glass, and drifting bodies. A gruesome graveyard that proves a violent struggle took place. But an antimatter detonation leaves absolutely no graveyard. It leaves a mathematically flawless 100-kilometer-wide sphere of absolute void. Within that specific perimeter, there isn't a single stray atom of hydrogen gas. There is no dust. There is no wreckage. It is a terrifyingly pristine bubble of utter emptiness, completely scrubbed from the fabric of reality. If an enemy ship happened to be sitting exactly on the outer edge of that 100-kilometer radius, half of the vessel would be perfectly sliced out of existence, while the remaining half would just drift silently into the dark, cleanly bisected by a ghost. The enemy wasn't just defeated today, they were entirely unmade. We have spent thousands of years of human history developing weapons designed to break things into smaller and smaller pieces. Swords to cut flesh, bullets to shatter bone, explosives to tear apart steel. But the antimatter torpedo represents the terrifying, absolute final chapter in the history of weaponized physics. It isn't a tool of destruction, it is an eraser. And the next time humanity decides to go to war in the dark forest of the cosmos, we won't be leaving behind massive monuments of twisted metal to remember the dead. We will just be leaving behind perfectly quiet, empty holes in the universe,